Welcome to the New Europe studios, where you can watch us make the news. I'm talking here today with Dr. Greg Austin from the EastWest Institute. The EastWest Institute was set up in 1981 in the heart of the Cold War, where they were trying to establish high-level relations between the West and the Soviet Union as it was then. And since then they've been carrying on their work, which has become more important in recent weeks. Could you just give us a bit of a rundown on what the EastWest Institute is trying to achieve?
Well, thank you, Andy. The EastWest Institute, as you said, was set up at the height of the Cold War to create opportunities for conversations in addition to the official Track 1 diplomacy. So we're a Track 2 organisation. So what we're looking to do in this current crisis is ensure that there are conversations behind the important official diplomacy. And the sorts of conversations we're interested in are those between specialists in places like Moscow, Kiev, Berlin, Brussels and Washington. So between specialists and former officials, where good fresh ideas can be created or might emerge to help address this very serious crisis that we're now facing in Europe.
I mean, I think a lot of people were shocked by the crisis. It reminds perhaps those of us who have been around the world for longer than some of the stranger and darker days of many decades ago. What do you think is behind these Russian moves on Ukraine?
Well, it's quite clear that we're not in such a dire military confrontation as we were at the height of the Cold War, when there were 50, 60 divisions facing each other across the inner German frontier. But the political character of this crisis is every bit as bad. This is the worst security crisis in Europe for at least 30 years, possibly 60 years. So we're in a situation where Russia, for its own reasons, has taken a number of decisions which have put Europe into a security crisis. So your question is a very good one. What are Russia's motivations? Well, Russia's motivations here are to ensure its own security. It feels its security has been threatened, so it has acted to protect its own interests. At the same time, Russia has also acted to reverse the historical outcome of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Clearly, President Putin does not want a restoration of the entire USSR as it was under the communists. He's not a communist, but there are parts of what he calls historic Russia which ended up outside of the Russian Federation with the breakup of the USSR.
And this is probably why we've seen some kind of other moves in the Baltics as well, which is causing some concern.
Yes, well, there's a big Russian population in Estonia, for example. The possibility that Russia would move against a country like Estonia, which is a member of NATO, is pretty far-fetched for the moment, I think. But what President Putin and Russia what they have clearly signalled right now is that Russia is taking a different view of what happened in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia is taking a different view than it took for the last 20 years. So we're now in a completely different situation where Russia is saying we want to revisit the outcome of the collapse of the USSR in 1991. We're fairly certain that the upper limit of that is not somehow reconstructing the entire USSR. That's impossible. But there are some lower limits of that, such as annexation of Crimea, which just occurred. And I think people are asking now, quite rightly, where in this spectrum of possible action between a little bit of territory like Crimea, and much larger slices of territory where there are Russian-speaking people, such as northern Kazakhstan, what are Russia's intentions?
Well, of course, I mean, Europe also has its intentions of trying to expand eastwards, which is where historic kind of complications since the Cold War from the ballistic defence, missile shield and so on have been played out. How would you say has Europe responded to this grave challenge?
Well, it's quite interesting that the eastern policy of the European Union is actually one of the major aggravating factors here in the crisis. So Russia came to view its security needs in Ukraine in terms of expansion eastwards of the European Union and an expansion eastwards of NATO. And what Russia was clearly signalling for at least the last 5 to 10 years was that if this Eastern policy continued, both in the European Union and in NATO, then Russia would take a very dim view of it in security terms. We are now seeing the result of that policy, where both the European Union and NATO pushed eastwards very aggressively, very, almost in a triumphalist mode, that the West won the Cold War, and that it was the perfectly legitimate right of a country like Ukraine to join both the European Union and NATO. Well, that, in my view, in one sense, was a legitimate interest of the EU and NATO, and a legitimate interest of Ukraine. But Russia signalled very clearly for over 10 years that if this happened, there would be consequences. We are now seeing the consequences. We now have a crisis, and the crisis is partly about the Eastern policy of the European Union.
I mean, Europe's case, as I'm sure you would understand, is that Ukrainian citizens will be better off if they look closer towards Europe and towards the European values, which surely, in some cases, must try putting troops on the border. We have expanded and look to expand eastwardly, but not through military means.
Well, that's right. On the one hand, it's hard to argue with the EU policy. It's hard to argue with those people in Ukraine who have advocated closer relations between Ukraine and the European Union. But on the other hand, we have a country like Russia which says, well, we have a view of security which is being undermined by those policies. And unfortunately, there was never any meeting of the minds between Russia and the West about what that security dilemma for Russia meant. Many people in the West don't accept the Russian argument, but that doesn't change the Russian argument, and doesn't.
Yeah.
So our problem here is, in terms of crisis management and crisis resolution, how do we build some common understanding between a very different Russian conception of security and that which the West has? Russia has returned, in a sense, to what you might call a 19th century realist, power-based understanding of security, where it wants a neutral Ukraine on its border. The West has been pursuing a very different policy of incorporating Ukraine into its sphere, whether it's the economic sphere of the European Union or the military sphere of NATO. And what we now have is a situation where Russia has acted to prevent the incorporation of Ukraine into the European sphere.
It's a bit hard to see where compromise might lie if the positions are Ukraine should be part of Europe and Ukraine should be part of more neutral. I mean, where can you see compromise or a solution coming out of this?
Well, that's a good question. I think that it's very hard to see compromise or a solution in the near term, because what we've got are two very fundamentally different views of territorial sovereignty, two very different views of power, and two very different views of legitimate interest. So this crisis is just beginning, in my view. There was a piece in New Europe this week which I wrote talking about the fact that the UN General Assembly had to vote on this issue rather than the Security Council, because there was no agreement in the Security Council. That, in a sense, demonstrates that we're headed for another 20, 30, 40-year military political crisis. This is not going to go away tomorrow. It's going to get worse before it gets better, and we have to find what are the crisis management mechanisms that are best appropriate to this situation. We're not going to find a resolution tomorrow or the next day.
This is a very alarming analysis from a person and an organisation which has extremely good contacts and a track record. Well, we should be alarmed, shouldn't we?
Well, we should be alarmed. It's a personal interpretation. It's not the Institute's view, because we don't take a view. But I think it's important to ask, where does this crisis end? We could imagine, for example, that the sanctions that have been imposed by the West may follow what we call the Tiananmen model, where the West imposed sanctions on China after the suppression of the demonstrations in 1989. Those sanctions lasted for several years, and most of them were ultimately lifted. That's not going to happen here. What's happened here is that, in the Western view, one state has used military force to take control of a slice of territory of another state. That is almost the biggest offence, the biggest crime that one state can commit in international law. The West is taking a position that unless that is reversed, then there will be consequences. And as long as that situation is not reversed, the consequences will continue and may possibly escalate.
And it's like another version of a phony war. I mean, Russia has used military means and these kind of mystery soldiers, but have not used the military in the way that they could have.
No, that in fact, and that in a sense helps keep the crisis very much subdued. And in a sense, people are confused when they look at it. The average person in the street will be confused when they see no massive use of force. The Russians were saying, well, there was no loss of life, so was it really that bad? So the absence of a really strong and powerful military element to this crisis is, in a sense, a very positive feature of it. But the fact that one state has taken a piece of territory of another state is, as I said, one of the most serious crimes in international relations in diplomatic terms. Whatever the justification was on the part of Russia, countries in the West are not going to take it lightly. So your term phony war, I think, is sort of good, but we're not really at that point where the military forces of each side are going to line up with each other and go to war over this. I mean, there was always the term phony war was used because everybody understood that ultimately there was going to be a big confrontation between Germany and Britain. So the 39 to 1940 period, but that doesn't apply here. There's not going to be a big military confrontation, but that doesn't detract from the seriousness of the political crisis.
I mean, I think we'd all be relieved, and there is signs, of course, on all sides that there is an upward limit of where they're going to use force. This is not a crazy, irrational act. But looking at this, there is this real lack of dialogue. There is what looks like a lack of a common ground. How can we work on this? This is what the Institute has specialised in. How can we get a dialogue going?
Well, there's lots of talking, but I think you're using the word dialogue in the correct way. There's not much meeting of minds at the official level. And it's in those circumstances where organisations like the EastWest Institute can provide a buttress to the official exchanges. In a situation where the two parties are talking, but there's not much dialogue of the sort, not much sort of meeting of minds, then it is important for other people to express their opinions and to come up with ideas about how there can be a meeting of minds, even if that ultimately is going to take several years, and I think this will take several years.
So, I mean, you would argue that what we need to do is get multi-level dialogues and discussions going, even if at the moment they're not going anywhere particularly fast. We're at least beginning to put in a solution that is ultimately going to be based on dialogue, discussion and agreement.
Yes, well, take the situation inside Ukraine itself. We all understand that it's important for the political forces in Ukraine to come to their own terms and to find their own solution for the future of Ukraine. Well, in just the same way, the people of Europe are entitled to have a point of view on security in Europe. It's something that you can't leave just to the leaders. And if the leaders are talking, but without result effectively, then the citizens are fully not only entitled but probably obliged to express their point of view on the security crisis and to help drive a solution which is peaceful and which avoids the worst aspects of possible confrontation. And what we should note in this particular case, even if there's not going to be a military crisis, is highly unlikely in terms of a confrontation of military forces between Russia and NATO. What is already on the cards is an escalating economic confrontation. We have to make sure that that economic confrontation does not damage the livelihoods of people in Ukraine, in Russia, and in Western Europe or Eastern Europe. This economic dimension, this economic confrontation we're now beginning to see, has to be controlled, and we have to try and limit its effects on the ordinary people. So a dialogue between different parties about what's the effect on them of this crisis, whether it's emotionally, politically or economically, is just a fundamental part of how our society operates.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that we've seen in Brussels with the approach coming in from Stefan Füle and bringing in Olaf, it shows that we're looking at an economic response to this, but also, as you bring it in yourself, that this is a regional problem between two very large, powerful regions.
Yeah, it's good to see the EU stepping in to try and help Ukraine at this moment of crisis, and whether that's through enhanced economic aid or through further steps to address corruption in Ukraine. But we have to understand that Russia's position is informed by the the robust and active approach of the European Union in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So we're actually, what EU is doing is, from many points of view, good, but is actually, from the Russian point of view, not what it wants. It wants an arrangement where Russia is an equal partner with the European Union in shaping, from the outside, the strategic orientation of Ukraine. And the strategic orientation of Ukraine has an economic aspect and a security aspect. Russia does not want a Ukraine that's completely in the EU's economic orbit.
Okay, but so when we're looking at it in this kind of way, we're looking at a situation where we could have a more wider ranging agreement and understanding with Russia than purely on Ukraine. This is a much bigger issue. It's something like trade, economics, partnerships, security arrangements. Russia seems to be wanting all of that in the way that America's got Europe's attention, China has got Europe's attention, and now this is part of Russia wanting our attention?
Well, that's in a sense a good framing of it. Russia definitely wants our attention. It's been asking for our attention to their concerns for at least 10 years, and we haven't been listening. That's why we have the crisis. So out of this crisis may come some opportunity to actually achieve an understanding that brings Russia and NATO much closer together fundamentally. But the NATO powers are not accepting what Russia did in Crimea. The NATO powers are not accepting the premises of Russian policy towards Europe. The NATO powers are denying Russia any right to influence the domestic situation in Ukraine. So that's the essence of the crisis. So until, in a sense, there's some resolution of that deep contradiction, then we won't see a resolution of the crisis. We'll probably see some sort of deepening of it. It's hard to imagine what the plateau point looks like. Yeah. So will it be in 2 months' time that we all just sit back and relax a bit? There's still sanctions in place. Russia still is a controlling power in Crimea, or will we see some ratcheting up of sanctions for each month that the situation remains unchanged? For each month that Russia does not reverse the annexation of Crimea, will we see an escalation of sanctions? It's a bit hard to know. There's got to be a plateau point, and it'll probably be reached sooner rather than later. But we're a little bit uncertain still what will happen in the next 2 to 3 months. What's that? How do we get to that plateau point? Once you get to the plateau point, you can then start to, sort of in a sense, negotiate some common positions and some common views.
I mean, as Russia has every right to pursue its own interests, Europe has its right to do that, and Ukraine, of course, has the right of self-determination. So what if we're going to cut this down to the absolute basics? It's back to Churchill again, and war is better than war, and it's time for dialogue to start in all sorts of different ways, and in time this will grow into something that ends up in agreements that can perhaps bring us all together, and if we want to be really optimistic, could help make the world a bit more secure by dealing with things that we've not dealt with for so long. Is that?
I think ultimately that's what will happen, but the very big problem that we confront is one that is almost beyond management by the NATO powers, for example. So what happened in 1991 with the breakup of the Soviet Union was, in Putin's view, one of the greatest catastrophes of the 20th century. He feels very strongly that that was a big mistake. Even the Treaty of Minsk, which was signed by the Russian Federation, the Ukrainian Republic, and the Belarusian Republic of the former USSR, the treaty which broke up the Soviet Union, that actually talked about creating a common military strategic space. Russia wants on its border a common military strategic space, of which Ukraine and Belarus are part. That's not what the West wants. It's not what many people in Ukraine want. It's not what the past governments of Ukraine have wanted. So we have this basic fundamental contradiction about how do we in Europe redress this historical event of 1991 in a way which keeps the peace, which satisfies the majority of people, and prevents some big deterioration of relations between Russia and the West. This crisis has been coming for 10 years. Its roots lie in events of 1991, which were deeply historic, absolutely monumental. So that's the crisis we're dealing with, is really in response to the collapse of the Soviet Union. It has just been delayed for 20 years, and now we're seeing it play out. So it's not easily going to be repaired simply by dialogue between leaders to try and find some diplomatic solution. This is about the social and economic structure, what Putin calls the common military strategic space around Russia.
So, well, thank you very much for that. I think you've explained the context of the current crisis in there, and you've pointed out some of the ways that ultimately it may well be resolved, even though this is clearly a massive problem underneath it all. It is going to take a lot of time and that rarest of all qualities, political goodwill.
Yes, Andy, that's true. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.